Bernie Sanders got on TV this morning on Morning Joe, and it was a really interesting segment. This particular segment deals with the big banks and breaking them up. I'm going to play this segment, and then Robert Reich is going to get on and give a pretty much full-throated dissertation on the U.S. banking system.
By what authority, and how would you go about breaking up the largest financial institutions in the country?
All right. You ready for the answer?
I'm ready. I want to hear it.
You do it in a couple of ways. One is you could use Section 121 of the Dodd-Frank legislation. And number two, better, and I would prefer it, is pass my legislation. And with my legislation, the legislation that I've introduced says that the Secretary of the Treasury will have the authority to investigate and determine which banks pose systemic risk to our economy, i.e., if they're too big to fail, they could bring down a significant part of the economy, and then within a period of time, the Secretary can break them up. 3 out of the 4 largest banks in this country today are bigger than they were when we had them out because they were too big to fail. So that's point number one. Point number two is that when you have 6 financial institutions that today have assets of about equivalent to about 58% of the GDP of this country, they issue 2/3 of the credit cards and 1/3 of the mortgages.
Right.
Don't you think that's a hell of a lot of economic and political power?
Nobody's going to let them go under.
I don't disagree. So another New York Daily News, the great paper's question: what does a bank like J.P. Morgan look like in year 2 of the Sanders administration?
And what I said is, after they're broken up, that is their decision to reconfigure how they want to do it. It's not the government's business. We tell you, you can't be this big, you're too much of a danger, to go from there. This is how big you can be. That's all. I'm not going to run J.P. Morgan. On this one, I guess I'm pretty conservative, and I believe in old-fashioned, boring banking. You make a deposit, you make a loan. To small and medium-sized businesses, to consumers who want to buy a home, want to buy a car. That's kind of my definition of what banking should be about.
With me now, University of California, Berkeley economics professor Robert Reich, who served, of course, as Labor Secretary in the Bill Clinton administration. He now supports Bernie Sanders. Secretary Reich, thank you so much for joining me again.
Hi, Tameron.
You heard the answer, the modified answer from Senator Sanders. So the question is, why couldn't he have given that answer to the Daily News when originally asked that question? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I read the transcript of his Daily News interview, and he did say in that interview that he, when asked, does the Fed have the power to do it alone, he said he didn't know, and he's not alone. Most experts really are confused about whether the Fed does have the power to close down a bank alone on its own. But then he said that he would do it as president, and he referred to legislation, and he also referred to his power over the appointees of a group. He didn't refer to the name of the group. Under Dodd-Frank, the group is the Federal Financial Stabilization Oversight Board, but any president would have a lot of power over that board with regard to decisions as to whether a bank had to be broken up. So I don't know where this kind of tempest came from, Tameron. I mean, candidates for office, whether they be Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton, or to a much larger extent the Republicans, don't specify in every little detail what regulatory agency and how they do what and where. And even with very big things like breaking up the big bank, Bernie Sanders has been very specific about how he would do that.
But I think perhaps it's not as egregious as Rick Perry saying he wants to shut down 3 departments, and he could not name the 3 during that infamous debate moment. But when you're Bernie Sanders, and this is, 95% of your message, this is your dominant message, and you don't have more specific answers, that I believe is why we got here. And now fast forward a couple of days, he doesn't say to Joe and Mika, I don't know. He provides answers. He fills in the holes. So why then not do that in the Daily News interview?
But
My
point is that he did with regard to his answer on Dodd-Frank. The only thing he didn't know was whether the Federal Reserve Board, which is an entirely different organization, has its own independent authority. That's irrelevant to a president's authority to shut down banks. And that's where the kerfluffle became sort of incomprehensible to most of us who live in the real world. Oh, by the way, it's not just breaking up the big banks. It's also Bernie's plan to have a single-payer healthcare plan, which is very, very central to his overall vision, and to provide tuition-free higher education for public universities, and mainly to get big money out of politics. I mean, this is what's fueling the entire Bernie Sanders campaign.
You mentioned the words real world, and in discussing how much of this people digest. When Bernie Sanders says he wants to go back to what he defined as boring banking, where you go to the bank, you put in some money, you get a loan, the simplest forms of banking, is that again a pie-in-the-sky description based on what you know as former labor secretary and the complexities of banking and this nation's economy? Do we really believe that that is the future of banking? Is that a pie-in-the-sky, unrealistic answer to what we can do to reform banking in an effective way, but in a real, honest way?
No, we used to have something, Tameron, called the Glass-Steagall Act that separated investment banking from commercial banking.
Right.
And Bill Clinton in 1999, with the advice of some of his advisors, not me certainly, I wasn't there then, joined Republicans and got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act, which allowed these big banks like Citibank to become Citigroup, these gigantic amalgams of investment banks and commercial banks that allowed them in turn to start gambling with depositors' money. That's got us into trouble. The Glass-Steagall Act did a very good job for 50 years after the Great Depression. We should have kept it. I don't understand why Hillary Clinton is so much against resurrecting the Glass-Steagall Act. Bernie Sanders has said from the beginning he wants it resurrected. I think that's a very important first step.
But the heart of my question, it goes back to also the idea of free tuition. You have many saying this notion of a basic boring bank, this notion of a free tuition, that these things are not just idealist or ideal thinking. It's not realistic when you look at the impact that free tuition would have on, for example, some of our nation's historic black universities. What dismantling the banks to the, quote, boring banking system would not only do to the economy, but as noted by Matt Lauer in the interview today, the millions of people, the thousands of people who work for banks, not at the top executive level, but in the banks. So I'm just asking you, does it
you're not getting rid of the banks, you're just breaking them up. It's like when the government told AT&T, Ma Bell, that it had to break up into 15 smaller bells. There were not fewer jobs. In fact, each of those small bells, regional bells, did better than the big Ma Bell was doing. It's the same thing with the banks. We're not getting rid of big banks. What Bernie Sanders is saying is you're going to break them up because their economic power and their economic power to do ill, as well as their political power, and we haven't even talked about that. I mean, I was in Washington. I know the power of Wall Street in Washington. It is unparalleled. You've got to do it. Before 1999, when the Glass-Steagall Act was basically got rid of by the Clinton administration and Republicans, we did have a much more boring banking system. And if you go back to tuition-free higher education, public education, that's the direction we were going in the 1950s, 60s, early 1970s here at the University of California, Berkeley, essentially tuition-free in 1968, 1969. I mean, why can't we go back to the road we were on, which made a lot of sense because, K through 12 public education was the idea behind the great American value of education. But as more and more education is needed, we should go from K through 12 to K through 16.
All right, former Labor Secretary Robert Reich, it's always insightful to speak with you. I greatly appreciate you making time for us on this Friday. Thank you.
Yeah, Robert Reich was absolutely right. Number one, they talk about boring banking, but it's the press of, or the push of the stockholders and the chairman of the boards and the group of people that are responsible for the profitability of these banks. And they consistently look for more and more and more ways to generate revenues so that they can generate bottom lines so that they can answer to their stockholders with increased profits, i.e. increased price for their stocks. And that's basically where this was. And that's why Glass-Steagall was broken up. And as far as the educational side, what they have done as far as education is concerned is a crime against humanity, because just as he said, education is supposed to be free, and the more education you need, the more education that should be made available to you, so that you know, if you want to go to college, in California was a model system. It was a model system. All the public state universities were, I'm not going to say absolutely free, but they cost really next to nothing. And as for the state universities in New York, the same thing. They weren't absolutely free, but the tuition rates were very low. Then all of a sudden it seems like the rug got pulled out from everybody, and they decided that they were going to start increasing the cost of tuitions. Now that might have been due to the slowdown in the economy and budgetary issues, but the educational system should have been the last place that they went to. And as a matter of fact, if it was necessary to raise taxes, most people would have agreed to raising taxes solely to fund education. Now, the problem with that is politicians never keep their words, but if they had created laws where the money was legally bound to the educational systems, we would have been a lot better. Tameron tries to get them, but when, you know, it's just like anything else. When somebody's trying to press a person on a subject that they are not fully aware of or informed in, and the person they're trying to press is completely aware and informed of, doesn't really make them look that good. Now, Robert Reich is a good guy, and he doesn't try to shame anybody, but he could have ran up one side of Tameron Hall and down the other if he had chosen to.